Imagine a busy street. A black man standing calm and composed as a white police officer throws water in his face, mocking him in front of a crowd. What the officer doesn't know, that man is about to become his new boss, and he's about to teach him a lesson the world will never forget. Stay with us for this interesting story. Power, wealth, or a high rank may give you a sense of superiority for a moment, but remember, the day always comes when you're held accountable for your actions. Racism, belittling communities, or disrespecting others based on religion may seem unnoticed now, but justice has a way of finding its mark. Respect is not just about others, it defines who you truly are. Think about it. What will your legacy be? Here in the United States, the law is equal for everyone, no matter your community, race, or religion. Diversity is what makes America strong, and unity is our greatest power. We stand together, respecting one another and sharing a deep love for our country. Patriotism is not just about flags or borders. It's about embracing every individual who calls this land home. In the USA, injustice has no place. Together, we uphold justice, equality, and the shared dream of freedom. We love the USA, and the USA loves all of us. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The scorching summer sun blazed down on the bustling streets of Riverdale, where life hummed with activity. People hurried past each other, bags in hand, conversations blending into a constant background murmur. Amid the commotion, the sharp sound of a police whistle cut through the air, drawing the attention of a few curious onlookers. Officer Mark Davis, clad in his crisp uniform, strode toward the cafe on the corner, his expression stern. Known for his brash and domineering demeanor, Davis carried himself with an air of authority that often veered into arrogance. His gaze fixed on a lone man standing near the cafe entrance. David Carter, a tall and composed black man in his 40s, stood beneath the cafe's awning, scrolling through his phone. Dressed in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, he exuded quiet confidence. To the casual observer, he was just another passerby, waiting for his meeting to begin. Yet today would prove otherwise. Davis stopped a few paces away, his hands resting on his belt. "Hey, you!" he barked, his tone laced with disdain. "What are you doing here, hanging around like this?" David looked up from his phone, his expression calm and polite. "I'm waiting for someone." He replied evenly, his voice steady but firm. Davis's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "Waiting for someone?" he repeated mockingly. "Huh? Is that what you're calling it these days? Looks more like loitering to me." A few bystanders began to take notice, their conversations fading into silence as they turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Among them was a local journalist, their phones discreetly aimed at the confrontation, recording every word. David met Davis's gaze, his expression unchanged. "I assure you, officer, I have every right to be here. I'm not causing any disturbance." Davis stepped closer, his posture imposing. "Listen, I don't need your attitude. This is a public space, and I have every right to question suspicious behavior." David's composure remained unshaken. "I understand your duty, officer, but I am not breaking any laws." The calmness in David's tone seemed to only irritate Davis further. His frustration bubbled to the surface, and a scornful smirk spread across his face. "You think you're better than me, huh? Standing there like you own the place." Without warning, Davis grabbed a paper cup from his patrol car's console, a cup filled with water, and hurled its contents at David's face. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd as the water splashed across David's face and shirt, leaving dark streaks on the fabric. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. David blinked, water dripping from his chin. His dignity, however, remained intact. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a handkerchief, dabbing his face without a word. Ugh. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder. The journalist, now openly recording, captured the outrage and disbelief spreading through the crowd. And, one voice rang out, "That's out of line." But Davis ignored it, standing tall with a smug expression. David finally spoke, his tone measured and resolute. "Officer, your behavior today will have consequences." Davis scoffed, his confidence unwavering. "Oh, really? And what do you think you're going to do about it?" David's eyes locked onto Davis's, a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You'll find out soon enough." The crowd parted slightly as David turned and walked calmly into the cafe, leaving Davis standing alone in the summer heat, oblivious to the storm his actions were about to unleash. The cafe bustled with energy, despite the oppressive heat of the summer day. Inside, David Carter sat at a small table near the window, a damp handkerchief folded neatly beside him. The water that Officer Davis had thrown at him still clung to his shirt, the damp patches a visible reminder of the public humiliation he had just endured. But his face betrayed no emotion, no anger, no frustration, just a calm resolve. He sipped his coffee slowly, his mind carefully piecing together the steps he would take next. Outside, the small crowd that had witnessed the incident lingered, their whispered conversations growing louder as the shock of what had unfolded began to sink in. Among them was a local journalist, an eager and observant young woman named Clara Monroe. Clara's phone still trembled slightly in her hand, the video she had recorded playing back in her mind. She had captured every moment. The confrontation, the water being thrown, and David's dignified reaction. It was raw, it was undeniable, and Clara knew it was important. A middle-aged man, red-faced with indignation, broke the silence first. "Did you see that? Who does he think he is, treating someone like that?" Another woman chimed in, her voice shaky with anger. "He didn't even do anything. That officer just humiliated him for no reason." Clara stood silently, her journalist instincts in overdrive. She opened her social media app and uploaded the video with a brief but pointed caption. "Officer throws water on a black man for standing outside a cafe. Is this what justice looks like? Police brutality, racism in America." She pressed post and felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another local story. It was bigger than that. Officer Davis, still leaning casually against his patrol car, waved dismissively at the murmurs of discontent around him. "Get a grip, folks," he called out, his voice laced with contempt. "The guy was loitering, just doing my job." His nonchalance only fanned the flames of the crowd's outrage. Someone shouted, "Your job doesn't include assaulting innocent people." Davis ignored the comment. A smug grin plastered across his face as he scanned the thinning crowd. Inside the cafe, David quietly watched from his seat by the window. Through the glass, he observed Davis's arrogance and the growing unease of the bystanders. A part of him wanted to confront Davis publicly, to pull rank and reveal his identity as the town's newly appointed police chief. But he resisted the urge. Timing was everything, and he knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about something much larger. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Clara's post began to spread like wildfire. The video garnered thousands of views within hours. Comments flooded in, ranging from outrage to disbelief, with hashtags like "Justice for David" and "Hold him accountable" trending on social media. It wasn't long before local news stations picked up the story. By evening, national outlets were airing the footage, and the name Officer Mark Davis became synonymous with unchecked authority and racial bias. Back at his small apartment, Davis watched the news coverage with mild irritation. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head as he flipped through the channels. "All this fuss over a little water? People are so sensitive these days." He glanced at his phone, which buzzed with a mix of messages. Some supportive, others condemning. "They'll forget about it in a week," he scoffed, tossing his phone onto the couch. But the world wasn't forgetting. The video became a rallying cry for communities already fed up with systemic racism and police misconduct. Protests began forming outside the Riverdale police station, with signs reading "Justice for All" and "Davis must go." Social media platforms were flooded with stories of similar incidents, with people sharing their experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. What had started as a single act of humiliation was now a movement demanding accountability. David, however, remained quiet. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends, family, and colleagues, all urging him to step forward. His sister Angela called him late that evening, her voice heavy with concern. "David, you need to say something," she insisted. "You can't just let this man walk all over you. People need to know who you are, what you stand for." "I know, Angie," David replied calmly, "but this isn't the time." "And when will it be the time?" she pressed. "You're the new chief of police. If anyone can address this, it's you." David sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I understand how this looks, but I don't want this to be about me. If I speak up now, it'll distract from the larger issue. Let the public demand justice first. Then I'll step in." Angela was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone softened. "I trust you, David. Just promise me you won't let this slide." "I won't," he assured her. "But I need to handle this the right way." Across town, Clara was sitting in her cramped apartment, refreshing her posts every few seconds. The views and comments were climbing exponentially, and her inbox was flooded with interview requests from major news outlets. Despite her excitement, Clara felt a deep sense of responsibility. She knew the power of the footage she had captured, and she was determined to use it to amplify the voices that had long been ignored. David spent the next day watching the chaos unfold. He read articles and scrolled through comments, taking in the full scope of the public's response. He noted the support, the outrage, and even the criticism. Some people questioned why he hadn't immediately retaliated or revealed his identity. But David remained steadfast in his decision to wait. As the days passed, the pressure on the Riverdale Police Department mounted. Citizens demanded Davis's suspension, and protests outside the station grew larger and more organized. Davis, still dismissive, began to feel the weight of public scrutiny, but clung to his belief that he had done nothing wrong. He even joked with a fellow officer. "What are they gonna do? Fire me for throwing water?" Meanwhile, David quietly strategized. He met with community leaders, activists, and members of the town council, ensuring that his eventual response would carry weight. He wanted to create change, not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to serve. Every move he made was calculated, every decision deliberate. He knew that when the time came to act, it had been impactful. The fallout from the incident continued to ripple outward, drawing national attention to Riverdale. Late-night talk show hosts mocked Davis's arrogance, while civil rights organizations called for systemic reforms. David's silence only fueled speculation, with many wondering why the man in the video had yet to step forward. Behind the scenes, David remained focused. He knew the time to reveal his identity was approaching, and when that moment came, he would ensure it was one the town and the nation would never forget. The town hall buzzed with anticipation as residents filled the space, their voices a mix of curiosity, anger, and impatience. Folding chairs lined the room, filled with a diverse cross-section of the community: local business owners, activists, students, and concerned citizens. At the center of it all stood the mayor, a composed figure in a dark suit, her expression reflecting the gravity of the moment. Everyone knew why they were there. The incident between Officer Davis and the unknown black man at the cafe had spiraled into a national controversy, and now the town awaited answers. Officer Mark Davis stood at the back of the room, his posture rigid and his jaw clenched. He had avoided public commentary on the incident, despite the mounting pressure from the media and protesters. His reputation was tarnished, his name synonymous with misconduct, but he still carried an air of defiance. He believed the mayor had called this meeting to placate the outraged masses, nothing more. In his mind, this was just political theater, and he planned to sit through it in silence. The crowd began to hush as the mayor stepped forward to the podium, her presence commanding attention. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," she started. "Thank you for coming. I called this meeting not only to address the incident that has brought so much attention to our town, but to outline how we move forward." Her words hung in the air, the tension in the room palpable. Davis leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowing as he awaited the inevitable critique of his actions. "The events of last week," the mayor continued, "have shone a spotlight on the challenges we face, not just as a town, but as a nation. Accountability is not optional for anyone, especially those sworn to protect and serve." The audience erupted in murmurs, some voices tinged with agreement, others with skepticism. The mayor held up a hand to silence them. "However," she said, her tone sharpening, "this is not just about one incident. It is about the culture we build, the standards we uphold, and the change we demand." Davis straightened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He was used to scrutiny, but not like this. The mayor's words carried a weight that unsettled him. "And with that," the mayor said, her voice growing firmer, "it is my honor to formally introduce you to Riverdale's new chief of police, David Carter." A wave of gasps rippled through the room, followed by an eruption of chatter. All eyes turned toward the side entrance as David Carter, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, stepped into the room. His calm and composed demeanor immediately silenced the crowd. He walked with quiet confidence to the podium, his face betraying no emotion. To those who had watched the viral video, the shock was electric. This was the man who had endured Davis's public humiliation without so much as raising his voice, and now he was their police chief. Davis froze, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked in disbelief, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The man he had insulted, humiliated, and dismissed was not only standing before him, but had authority over him. For the first time in years, Davis felt genuinely exposed. David reached the podium and adjusted the microphone, his steady gaze sweeping across the room. He allowed the murmurs to die down before he spoke, his voice clear and resonant. "Thank you, Mayor Daniels," he began, nodding respectfully toward her. "And thank you to everyone here tonight for your time, your concern, and your willingness to hold us all accountable." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. "Before I address the events that have brought us here, I want to share a bit about myself. I've spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, working my way up from a patrol officer in a small town to leadership roles in larger cities. My goal has always been the same: to serve with integrity, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that the law applies equally to everyone." A smattering of applause broke out, but David held up a hand, his expression serious. "But I also know that our system is far from perfect," he continued. "And last week I experienced firsthand what happens when those entrusted with power abuse it." Davis's face flushed as David's words hit their mark. He felt the eyes of the room on him, some accusatory, others incredulous. He shifted uncomfortably, but kept silent. David turned slightly, addressing the crowd directly. "I'm sure many of you have seen the video that has circulated these past few days. Yes, that was me outside the cafe. Yes, I stood there as water was thrown at my face. And yes, I chose not to react. Not because I was powerless, but because I understood the importance of restraint." The room buzzed with murmurs, admiration mixing with curiosity. Clara, the journalist who had posted the video, sat in the front row, her phone perched in her lap, capturing every word. Her heart raced as she realized the magnitude of the moment. David continued, his voice unwavering. When I decided to take on the role of police chief in this town, I knew there would be challenges. But I accepted the position because I believe in this community and in its potential for growth. What happened last week was unacceptable, not just because of the actions of one officer, but because it reflects a deeper issue that we must address together. He paused, his gaze locking onto Davis for a brief moment before sweeping back across the audience. "Accountability starts at the top," David said firmly. "And let me be clear, no one is above the law, including those who enforce it." A wave of applause erupted, the tension in the room breaking momentarily. Davis clenched his fists, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of public condemnation pressing down on him. David raised his hand again, calling for silence. "I am not here to tear down anyone. I am here to build trust, to foster understanding, and to create a culture of respect. But that cannot happen without acknowledgement of the truth. We must confront our biases, our mistakes, and our failures. Only then can we move forward." The mayor nodded approvingly as David's words resonated. Even some of the skeptics in the audience found themselves nodding along, drawn in by his sincerity and vision. David concluded his speech with a call to action. "I invite every member of this community to hold us accountable, to speak out when you see injustice, to demand better from those in positions of power, and to remember that change is not a moment, it is a movement." The room erupted into a standing ovation, the sound echoing off the walls. Clara wiped away a tear, overcome by the power of David's words. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the applause subsided, David stepped away from the podium, walking back to his seat with the same quiet dignity that had marked his entrance. The mayor took the stage again, thanking the audience and promising swift action to address the concerns raised. Davis remained rooted in place, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He was no longer the confident officer who had dismissed the cafe incident as trivial. He was a man grappling with the reality of his actions and the undeniable truth that the man he had wronged now stood as his superior. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations lively and hopeful. Many approached David to shake his hand, to thank him, to offer their support. Others lingered in clusters, discussing the implications of what they had just witnessed. Clara, ever the journalist, snapped photos and took notes, determined to capture the full scope of the evening. As David left the town hall, the weight of the night settled over him. He knew this was only the beginning. Change would not come easily, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But as he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The community was watching, and he was ready to lead. Behind him, Davis slipped out quietly, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with something far more subdued. For the first time, he questioned his own beliefs, his biases, and the culture that had allowed him to act without consequence for so long. The confrontation with David had shaken him, and though he would never admit it aloud, it had also planted a seed of reflection that might one day grow into understanding. For now, the town of Riverdale stood on the brink of transformation. its people galvanized by the events of the past week. And at the center of it all was David Carter, a man determined to turn a moment of injustice into a lasting legacy of change. The announcement of an internal investigation into Officer Mark Davis's actions sent shockwaves through the community. The town that had been bustling with debates and heated arguments suddenly unified in its demand for accountability. What had started as a viral video had now evolved into a broader call for systemic change. David Carter, now publicly known as the town's new police chief, spearheaded the effort to ensure transparency in the investigation. He emphasized the importance of due process, but his insistence on fairness didn't dilute his resolve to address the misconduct head-on. David's reputation for integrity made him a respected figure, even among those who had initially doubted him. He made it clear that the investigation would leave no stone unturned. The viral video became the cornerstone of the case. Clara, the journalist who had captured the incident, willingly submitted her footage as evidence. It clearly showed Davis confronting David, throwing water at him, and then dismissing the public outrage that followed. Witness testimonies from bystanders at the cafe corroborated the video, painting a vivid picture of Davis's actions that day. But the investigation didn't stop at the video. David insisted on reviewing Davis's service record, which revealed a troubling pattern. Over the years, Davis had accrued multiple complaints from civilians, most of which had been dismissed or lightly addressed. Allegations of racial bias, excessive force, and verbal harassment dotted his file, each one a testament to a system that had failed to hold him accountable. As this information surfaced, the town's residents became even more vocal. Protests erupted outside the police department, with citizens demanding not just disciplinary action against Davis, but a complete overhaul of the department's practices. Signs reading "Justice for All," "No Room for Racism," and "Accountability Now" filled the streets. The chants of the protesters echoed through the town, a powerful reminder of the growing demand for change. David watched the protests from his office, his expression a mix of determination and weariness. He understood the anger and frustration fueling the demonstrations. The community wasn't just reacting to one incident. They were responding to years of mistrust and neglect. He knew the investigation into Davis was only the beginning. Systemic reform would require more than one high-profile case. It would demand a complete cultural shift within the department. Meanwhile, Davis found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated. The once confident officer was now suspended from duty, his badge and gun temporarily stripped away. The suspension, while procedural, felt like a public condemnation. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of the town's judgment. Neighbors avoided him, former colleagues distanced themselves, and his name became a lightning rod in the media. For Davis, the backlash was more than he could handle. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, a figure of authority whose actions would never be questioned. Now that belief was crumbling under the scrutiny of the public and his own department. He spent his days confined to his home, watching news segments that dissected his every move and scrolling through social media posts that condemned him as the face of systemic injustice. As the investigation progressed, more troubling details came to light. Interviews with former colleagues revealed a culture of silence within the department, where complaints against officers like Davis were often swept under the rug, to preserve the department's image. This revelation only fueled the protests, with activists calling for external oversight and independent review boards to prevent future cover-ups. David remained steadfast in his approach. He refused to let personal feelings dictate the outcome of the investigation, insisting that the process remain impartial. He held press conferences to update the public, emphasizing the importance of evidence and accountability. His transparency earned him widespread support, even as the pressure mounted. Behind closed doors, Davis's world continued to unravel. His suspension cut off his financial stability, leaving him to rely on savings that were quickly depleting. The isolation he experienced forced him to confront the reality of his actions. He replayed the incident in his mind, each time feeling the sting of public humiliation and the weight of his own arrogance. The protests outside the department grew larger with each passing day. What started as a local demonstration had gained national attention, drawing activists and allies from neighboring towns and cities. Civil rights organizations offered their support, amplifying the call for reform. The spotlight on Riverdale intensified, turning it into a symbol of the broader fight for justice. As the investigation neared its conclusion, David prepared to meet with the department's review board. The evidence against Davis was overwhelming, and the testimonies from witnesses painted a clear picture of misconduct. But David knew that the board's decision would carry implications far beyond this one case. It would set a precedent for how the department handled future incidents and whether it could begin to rebuild trust with the community. The board convened in a closed-door session, with David presenting the findings of the investigation. He spoke with the same calm authority that had defined him throughout the ordeal, laying out the facts without embellishment. He emphasized the need for accountability, not just for Davis, but for the department as a whole. After hours of deliberation, the board reached its decision. Davis would face formal disciplinary action, including mandatory training on bias and de-escalation, as well as a demotion from his current rank. Additionally, the department would implement new policies to address the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Davis to act with impunity. When the decision was announced to the public, it was met with mixed reactions. Some praised the department's commitment to accountability, while others felt the punishment was insufficient. The protests began to shift focus, with organizers calling for further reforms and continued vigilance. For Davis, the consequences were life-altering. The demotion and disciplinary action marked the end of the unchecked authority he had once enjoyed. He returned to the department a changed man, though the extent of his transformation remained to be seen. David, on the other hand, saw the decision as a step forward, albeit a small one. He knew the work was far from over, but he remained committed to the path of reform. The incident with Davis had become a catalyst for change, igniting a movement that extended beyond Riverdale. As the town continued to grapple with its past, David stood as a beacon of hope, guiding it toward a more just and equitable future. David Carter knew that his appointment as police chief came with an enormous responsibility, one magnified by the public scrutiny following the incident with Officer Mark Davis. The community's trust in law enforcement had been eroded over years of neglect and systemic issues. For David, restoring that trust wasn't just about addressing one officer's misconduct. It was about reshaping the very foundation of the department he now led. David started his reform journey with a clear vision. He believed that education and accountability were the pillars upon which a fair and effective police force could stand. His first step was introducing mandatory training programs for all officers. These programs emphasized diversity, inclusion, and de-escalation tactics. The sessions were designed to challenge biases, foster empathy, and equip officers with tools to handle complex situations without resorting to force. The training sessions were not merely lectures, but immersive workshops. Officers participated in role-playing scenarios where they were placed in the shoes of civilians facing challenging interactions with law enforcement. These exercises were eye-opening for many, forcing them to confront the disparities in how different communities experienced policing. David personally attended some of these sessions, not as a chief, but as a participant, demonstrating his commitment to the process. The reforms didn't stop at training. David introduced new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Body cameras, already in use, were now paired with stricter guidelines on their activation and use. Complaints against officers were subjected to external review boards ensuring impartiality. The department also began publishing quarterly reports detailing disciplinary actions and community engagement efforts. While these measures addressed internal operations, David knew that real change required bridging the gap between the police and the people they served. And to this end, he launched a series of community forums, inviting residents to share their experiences and concerns. These meetings were held in local schools, churches, and community centers, ensuring accessibility for all. The forums were not without their challenges. Many residents arrived with deep-seated anger and mistrust, their voices filled with pain as they recounted incidents of discrimination and mistreatment. David listened to every story, his presence calm and unwavering. He never dismissed their grievances or offered empty platitudes. Instead, he acknowledged the department's failures and pledged to do better. At one such forum, a young mother named Alicia stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. She shared how her teenage son had been unfairly stopped and frisked by officers multiple times on his way home from school. The fear in her eyes was palpable as she described the anxiety her family lived with every day. David responded with empathy, assuring her that he would personally look into the matter. His sincerity resonated with the audience, earning him a standing ovation. Beyond the forums, David reached out to local activists and advocacy groups. He invited them to collaborate on initiatives aimed at fostering mutual understanding and respect between the police and the community. These partnerships led to programs like Coffee with a Cop, where officers and residents could engage in informal conversations over coffee, and youth police academies, where young people learned about the role of law enforcement while building relationships with officers. David's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, the community began to see the police department in a new light. Officers who had once been viewed with suspicion now participated in neighborhood cleanups and food drives. The sight of uniformed officers helping residents paint a community center or distribute meals during a food drive became a common occurrence, symbolizing a newfound sense of unity. Of course, not everyone embraced the changes. Some officers resisted the new policies, viewing them as unnecessary or overly restrictive. David addressed these concerns directly, holding one-on-one meetings with dissenting officers to understand their perspectives. He emphasized that the reforms were not about undermining the police force, but about ensuring that it served the community with integrity and fairness. For those unwilling to adapt, David made it clear that the department had no room for complacency or defiance. One of David's most ambitious initiatives was the creation of a civilian oversight committee. Composed of local residents from diverse backgrounds, the committee was tasked with reviewing police practices and making recommendations for improvement. This move was met with skepticism by some within the department, but David stood firm, believing that community involvement was essential for rebuilding trust. Through these efforts, David's leadership began to inspire change not just within the police department, but across the entire town. Stories of his dedication spread, and his actions began to resonate on a personal level with those he served. At a local high school, students invited him to speak about his vision for justice and equality. His words, filled with hope and determination, inspired many young people to see law enforcement as a potential ally rather than an adversary. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the town began to shift. Incidents of excessive force decreased, and the number of civilian complaints dropped significantly. The community forums, once filled with anger and mistrust, became spaces for dialogue and collaboration. Residents who had once avoided the police now found themselves working alongside officers to address shared concerns. David's journey was far from over, but the progress was undeniable. His commitment to reform had not only restored faith in the police department, but also strengthened the bonds within the community. Each step forward reinforced his belief that change was possible when approached with humility, determination, and a willingness to listen. Through it all, David remained focused on his ultimate goal, creating a police force that truly served and protected all members of the community, regardless of their background. His efforts had planted the seeds of transformation, and he was determined to nurture them until they blossomed into a legacy of justice and equality. Stripped of his badge, Mark Davis found himself in uncharted territory. For years, his uniform had served as both his armor and his identity. Now, without it, he was exposed. No longer an untouchable figure of authority, but a man at the center of a public scandal. The viral video of him throwing water on David Carter had not only cost him his position, but it also made him a symbol of systemic injustice. Everywhere he went, whispers and stares followed. At first, Davis reacted with anger and denial. He convinced himself that he was the victim, that the backlash was an overreaction fueled by social media hysteria. One mistake, he muttered to himself repeatedly, as if saying it enough times would absolve him. But the world didn't seem inclined to forgive him so easily. Protesters gathered outside his home, their signs and chants piercing the bubble of self-righteousness he had cocooned himself in. Friends he thought would stand by him distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations. Part of his mandatory suspension included sensitivity training, something he initially dismissed as unnecessary. "What could they possibly teach me?" he scoffed to his lawyer. though the lawyer's warning about his precarious legal and financial position left him no choice but to comply. His first session was awkward and uncomfortable. Davis sat in a circle with people from various walks of life, all there to confront their biases. Listening to their stories, he couldn't help but feel defensive, as though every narrative of injustice and discrimination was a personal attack. It was during one of these sessions that Davis came face to face with David Carter. David, always calm and composed, had volunteered to speak as part of the program. When Davis saw him walk into the room, his stomach tightened. He hadn't expected to see David again, much less in such a vulnerable setting. David addressed the group without bitterness, sharing his journey as a black man in law enforcement. He spoke about the challenges of balancing his identity with his duty and about the changes he hoped to bring to the system. "We all have our blind spots," David said, his voice steady, "but the only way we grow is by acknowledging them and doing the work to overcome them." When the session ended, David approached Davis. The room fell silent, everyone watching to see how the encounter would unfold. Davis tensed, expecting a lecture or a confrontation, but David simply extended his hand. "Mark," he said, his tone neutral, "I think we should talk." The two men found a quiet corner, and for a moment, neither spoke, the weight of the unspoken hanging heavy between them. Finally, David broke the silence. "I don't hate you, Mark," he said, "but I do think you owe it to yourself to ask why you acted the way you did, and that's the only way you'll move forward." Davis bristled at the suggestion, his defenses flaring. "You think I'm some kind of monster?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "I've served this town for years. I've done my job." David met his gaze steadily. "You're not a monster," he replied. "But you let your biases control you. That day, you didn't see me as a man. You saw me as a threat. And that's a problem, Mark. Not just for you, but for everyone you've served." The words hit Davis harder than he cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down, he knew David was right. For years, he had operated on assumptions, seeing the world through a narrow lens shaped by his own experiences and prejudices. That lens had failed him, and it had failed the community he was sworn to protect. Over the next few weeks, Davis began to reflect more deeply on his actions. The sensitivity training sessions, once a chore, became an opportunity for self-exploration. He started to listen, really listen, to the stories of others. One story in particular stuck with him. A young black man's account of being stopped and frisked while walking home from work. The man's fear and humiliation mirrored what Davis had seen in David's eyes that day outside the cafe. Davis couldn't escape the parallels. Slowly, the walls of his denial began to crumble. He reached out to a counselor recommended through the training program, someone who could help him unpack the deeply ingrained biases he had carried for so long. It wasn't easy. Confronting his own prejudices felt like peeling away layers of armor, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. One day, Davis found himself writing a letter. It was addressed to David Carter. In it, he acknowledged his actions and their impact. He apologized, not just for the water, but for the years of assumptions and behaviors that had led to that moment. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he wrote, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to change, not because I have to, but because I need to." When David received the letter, he read it carefully, noting the sincerity in Davis's words. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to let Davis continue on his journey. For David, the letter wasn't the end point. It was a step, one of many that Davis would need to take. In the months that followed, Davis began volunteering with community organizations, working alongside people he once viewed with suspicion. He attended town hall meetings, not as a defender of the status quo, but as someone eager to learn. Some people remained skeptical of his transformation, questioning whether it was genuine or merely a bid to salvage his reputation. Davis didn't blame them. He knew trust had to be earned. For Davis, redemption wasn't about erasing his past. It was about taking accountability and using his experiences to become a better person. Whether the community fully forgave him or not, he was determined to continue the work, knowing that change started with him. The weeks following the incident were a whirlwind of change and introspection for both David Carter and the town. As the dust settled, the ripples of David's leadership began to take tangible form. His vision for reform, born out of both personal conviction and professional necessity, was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. David worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, activists, and his police department to ensure the reforms were not just surface-level fixes, but systemic changes. Training programs on de-escalation and cultural competency were rolled out, with mandatory participation for all officers. The department's hiring practices were overhauled to focus on diversity and equity, ensuring the force reflected the community it served. Public accountability measures, including civilian oversight boards, were implemented, giving residents a direct voice in law enforcement policies. The community, initially skeptical, began to see the difference. Officers who once patrolled with indifference were now seen attending community events, engaging with residents in meaningful ways. Neighborhoods that had long felt alienated by the police started to report feeling safer, not because of an increased presence, but because of a newfound trust. The protests that had once been filled with anger and frustration transformed into rallies of solidarity and hope. David's work did not go unnoticed beyond the town. His reforms gained national attention, sparking conversations in neighboring cities about the importance of re-examining policing practices. Invitations for speaking engagements poured in, but David remained grounded, insisting that his priority was the town and its people. "Real change starts at home," he often said, refusing to let the spotlight distract him from his mission. Mark Davis, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions. The investigation into his behavior concluded, and the findings were damning. The viral video, paired with a history of complaints, painted a clear picture of misconduct and bias. Davis's dismissal from the force was made permanent, a decision that brought closure to many who had called for accountability. But Davis's story didn't end there. Stripped of his badge and authority, he was forced to confront the person he had been and the damage he had caused. For weeks he grappled with anger and shame, his initial denial giving way to painful self-awareness. The conversations he had had during sensitivity training replayed in his mind, as did David's calm yet peaceful words during their meeting. Faced with a choice, to retreat into obscurity or attempt to change, Davis took the harder path. He began volunteering at a local nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, many of whom had stories eerily similar to those he dismissed during his time as an officer. Listening to them, he saw himself in a harsh light, realizing the weight of his biases and how they had shaped his actions. Slowly he began to rebuild, not as a police officer, but as a man striving to make amends. One day, Davis approached David with a proposal. He wanted to share his story publicly, not to garner sympathy, but as a cautionary tale. With David's blessing, Davis began speaking at community forums and schools, openly acknowledging his mistakes and urging others to confront their own biases. His raw honesty resonated with some, though not all were ready to forgive. Still, Davis persisted, knowing that redemption wasn't about winning approval, but about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. For David, seeing Davis's transformation was a testament to the power of accountability and second chances. He didn't excuse Davis's actions, but he admired his willingness to change. Together, they appeared at a town hall meeting, their joint presence symbolizing both the cost of prejudice and the possibility of growth. As months turned into years, the town became a model for reform, cited in national discussions about policing. David's leadership inspired other cities to follow suit, and his name became synonymous with integrity and progress. Yet for all the accolades and recognition, David remained focused on the people he served, constantly reminding himself of the day that had sparked it all. In the end, the story wasn't just about a single incident or two men on opposite sides of an altercation. It was about a community's ability to confront its flaws, its willingness to embrace change, and its determination to create a future defined by justice and respect. David's triumph wasn't just his own, it was a collective victory, proof that even in the face of adversity, growth and transformation were always possible. The sun was setting over the town, casting a warm golden glow across the streets where so much had changed in just a few months. David Carter strolled down the main avenue, his strides measured, his mind heavy with reflection. The cafe where it all began stood in the distance, a poignant reminder of the day that had set everything in motion. He thought about the confrontation with Mark Davis, the sting of water dripping down his face, and the humiliation he had felt in that moment. It would have been easy to act out of anger, to demand immediate retribution. Instead, he had chosen a different path, one rooted in patience, strategy, and the belief that true change required more than just punishment. It required understanding, even in the face of ignorance. As he walked, David noticed familiar faces, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, families sharing ice cream on park benches, kids playing basketball in a community court, revitalized by new funding. These were the people he had promised to serve and protect, not just with words, but with action. They're symbols of trust, rebuilt piece by piece through effort and empathy. David's thoughts turned to Mark Davis. In the weeks following the incident, Davis had become a figure of controversy, reviled by many. Yet, against the odds, Davis had taken responsibility for his actions. He hadn't sought sympathy or forgiveness, but had chosen to use his experience as a lesson for others. David respected that. It was a testament to the possibility of redemption, however imperfect or incomplete it might be. Passing the park, David paused to watch a group of officers playing a casual game of soccer with neighborhood kids. It was a small scene, but one that spoke volumes about how far they had come. The police weren't just enforcers of the law anymore. They were part of the fabric of the community, working to rebuild bonds that had long been frayed. As he resumed his walk, David's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a neighboring city's mayor, inviting him to speak at an upcoming summit on police reform. David smiled faintly, reminded that his work in this town was resonating far beyond its borders. But as gratifying as the recognition was, he knew his focus needed to remain here, where the change had begun. Reaching the town square, David stood for a moment, taking it all in, the chatter of residents, the hum of activity. It all felt different now. This wasn't the same town that had looked the other way during moments of injustice. It was a town that had faced its flaws head-on and emerged stronger, more unified. A young boy approached him hesitantly, holding out a hand-drawn picture. "Thank you, Chief Carter," the boy said shyly, "for making things better." David crouched down to take the drawing, a colorful depiction of the town's police station with smiling officers and happy residents. He felt a lump rise in his throat, but managed to respond with a warm "thank you. You're why I do this." As the boy ran back to his parents, David folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It was a small gesture, but one that encapsulated everything he had worked for. A town where children could dream freely, unburdened by the weight of division or fear. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been anger, doubt, and resistance along the way. But standing there in the heart of the town, David felt a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one man's redemption or one community's transformation. It was about the hope that every step forward, no matter how small, could pave the way for a better future. As the first stars appeared in the sky, David turned and continued his walk, greeted warmly by residents of all backgrounds. The streets that once bore witness to division now stood as symbols of unity and progress. And with every step, David carried the quiet conviction that the story wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something greater, a testament to what could be achieved when courage met compassion and justice met hope. Injustice and accountability? The story opens with a vivid portrayal of the imbalance of power and prejudice. Officer Davis's humiliating act, throwing water on David, exemplifies systemic bias in action, a moment that encapsulates the larger issues of injustice within law enforcement. The subsequent public outcry, fueled by the viral video, underscores the demand for accountability, not just for Davis, but for the institution he represents. This theme is carried through the investigation, Davis's suspension, and the broader push for police reform. Composure and leadership, David's response to the incident is the epitome of grace under pressure. While others might act impulsively or seek immediate revenge, David chooses to remain composed, using the incident as a catalyst for meaningful change. His strategic patience, waiting for the right moment to reveal his position as police chief, demonstrates leadership and wisdom. His speech at the town hall is a turning point where he shifts the narrative from personal humiliation to a call for justice and equality, inspiring action and reflection, hope and change. The resolution focuses on healing and transformation. David's reforms and community engagement show that change is possible when empathy and accountability are prioritized. The redemption arc of Officer Davis, whether full or partial, reflects the potential for individuals to confront their biases and grow. Meanwhile, the town itself becomes a symbol of progress, evolving from a place marked by division to one striving for unity and understanding. The closing scene emphasizes this hope, with David walking through a transformed town, greeted by residents who reflect the success of his efforts. Each theme is interwoven to create a narrative that is not only impactful, but also resonates deeply with universal values of justice, empathy, and the power of leadership to effect change. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories.